Honestly, Margaret, Baxter contributes more to this family than you do. My daughter-in-law said it with a soft laugh as she adjusted the silk napkin on her lap, like she'd made some harmless little joke over dinner. Everyone at the table smiled awkwardly except me. Even Ethan looked down at his plate instead of looking at his own mother. I sat there quietly while their golden retriever rested comfortably on the padded chair beside the dining room window, wearing a blue collar with his name stitched in gold thread. The dog had his own seat at the table. I didn't. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from. Because sometimes the people farthest away understand your pain better than the family sitting right in front of you. Ethan and Vanessa had invited me to their housewarming dinner that Saturday evening. Their new home sat high on a hill outside Bellevue, Washington, in one of those neighborhoods where every mailbox looked expensive and every lawn was trimmed like a golf course. The driveway alone was larger than the first apartment my late husband and I rented back in 1978. I remember standing outside my car for a moment before walking in, smoothing the wrinkles from my navy cardigan and trying not to feel nervous. I had helped pay for that house. Not part of it. Most of it. 6 months earlier, I emptied my retirement account so Ethan could save the business. That was how he explained it over the phone one rainy Tuesday night, while I sat alone eating canned soup in my apartment. He sounded desperate back then. Said layoffs were coming. Said investors were pulling out. Said if he lost the company, he'd lose everything he'd spent 15 years building. I didn't even hesitate. Mothers like me never do. By the time penalties and taxes were deducted, I wired him almost $280,000. Everything Harold and I spent 40 years saving. My future disappeared with a single electronic transfer. But when Ethan hugged me at the front door that evening, he barely mentioned it. "Mom, you made it," he said distractedly before turning back toward guests carrying wine bottles and designer desserts into the kitchen. Vanessa looked beautiful in cream-colored cashmere and diamond earrings that caught the light every time she moved her head. "Margaret," she said politely, air-kissing my cheek without touching it, "your seat is over there." She pointed toward a small round table near the back hallway, not the large dining table where everyone else sat. I told myself not to be sensitive. Maybe there wasn't enough room. Maybe I was imagining things. The house smelled like rosemary chicken and expensive candles. Soft jazz floated through hidden speakers in the ceiling. Couples laughed around me while I sat quietly sipping water and watching strangers admire the marble countertops I probably helped pay for. Then dinner started. Vanessa placed a small white plate on the floor beside Baxter's chair before serving me last. "He gets anxious if he feels excluded," she explained lightly when she noticed me looking at the dog. A few people chuckled. I smiled politely because older women learn how to survive humiliation without making others uncomfortable. But then one guest asked how long Ethan and Vanessa had lived there, and Vanessa laughed while swirling wine in her glass. "Honestly, this whole place only happened because Ethan works non-stop," she said proudly. Then her eyes flicked toward me. "And because Baxter's emotional support keeps this family sane. Frankly, he contributes more around here than some people." The room went still for half a second. Just enough time for everyone to understand exactly who she meant. Ethan gave a weak little laugh. Weak. Embarrassed. Cowardly. I looked down at my hands in my lap, hands swollen slightly from arthritis after decades of cleaning houses, waitressing night shifts, and folding laundry in motel basements so my son could have opportunities one never had. Across the room, Baxter barked once happily as Vanessa reached down to pet him. And for the first time in my 70 years, I realized there are insults so quiet they don't sound cruel until you replay them alone later in the dark. I left their house just after 10 that night. Rain tapped softly against my windshield as I drove back toward my apartment in Tacoma, and the farther I got from Bellevue, the quieter the world seemed to become. The expensive neighborhoods disappeared first, then the polished restaurants and glowing storefronts. Eventually it was just wet pavement, gas stations, and the pale reflection of headlights sliding across the dashboard. I kept hearing Vanessa's voice in my head. "Frankly, he contributes more around here than some people." It was strange how humiliation worked at my age. When you are young, pain arrives loudly. You cry. You argue. You slam doors. But when you are 70, embarrassment settles into your chest slowly, like cold water leaking through cracks in a ceiling. Quiet. Steady. Impossible to ignore. My apartment smelled faintly like lavender cleaner and old books when I walked inside. Small places hold silence differently. Every sound feels larger. I hung my coat carefully by the door and stood in the kitchen staring at the stack of unopened mail beside the microwave. Electric bill. Pharmacy reminder. Property tax notice from the little vacation cabin Harold bought 30 years ago near Cannon Beach. I had almost sold that cabin last spring before Ethan called asking for help. I remember sitting at this same kitchen table while he explained everything to me over the phone. "It is temporary, Mom," he promised. "Once the company stabilizes, I will take care of you the way Dad would have wanted." I believed him because Ethan used to be the kind of little boy who cried when birds flew into windows. He used to save allowance money to buy me carnations from the grocery store every Mother's Day. Somewhere along the way, life had polished the softness out of him. I opened my banking app before bed even though I already knew what it would show. $214.63 in checking. My retirement account closed. Savings nearly gone. I stared at the number for a long time while the refrigerator hummed softly behind me. Harold and I had spent 4 decades building that security. He worked maintenance for the ferry system. I cleaned vacation rentals along the Oregon coast every summer until my knees started swelling too badly. We skipped vacations, drove used cars, repaired things, instead of replacing them. Also, we could grow old without becoming a burden to anyone. The irony almost made me laugh. Around midnight, I went into the bathroom and opened the medicine cabinet. My blood pressure prescription had 8 pills left. I broke one in half carefully with a butter knife because stretching medication had become another habit lately. Then I caught my own reflection in the mirror. Silver hair slipping loose from its clip. Tired blue eyes. A woman who looked smaller than she used to. Not physically. Spiritually. I suddenly remembered something Vanessa once said during Thanksgiving 3 years earlier, while showing guests around her old condo. "I could never live like previous generations did," she laughed. "I actually want to enjoy my money while I am alive." At the time I thought it was harmless. Young people say careless things sometimes. But lying awake in my narrow bed that night, listening to rain strike the windows, I finally understood something painful. Some people do not see sacrifice as love. They see it as weakness. And once they realize you will give them everything, they stop valuing the cost entirely. The following week passed strangely quiet. Ethan did not call once. Not on Tuesday when I usually checked in after his board meetings. Not on Thursday when I always reminded him to wear a heavier coat because Seattle mornings turned colder this time of year. Silence has weight when it comes from your own child. You start measuring time differently. Every hour without a message feels deliberate. By Friday afternoon, I convinced myself I was overthinking things. Ethan was busy. Successful people were always busy. That was what I kept telling myself while folding laundry in my apartment and listening to the old clock above the stove tick louder than usual. Then Chloe called unexpectedly around 6 that evening. "Grandma, are you coming tomorrow?" she asked softly. "Coming where, sweetheart?" There was a small pause. "Dad's birthday dinner." My stomach tightened. Ethan's birthday was Saturday. I had completely forgotten the date because he always celebrated with me separately before he married Vanessa. "Oh," I said carefully. I did not realize there were plans. Another pause. Children always hesitate right before telling uncomfortable truths. Mom said maybe it would be easier if it was just immediate family this year. Immediate family. The words landed harder than I expected. I thanked Chloe for calling and told her I hoped everyone had a wonderful dinner. My voice sounded calm enough that even I almost believed it. After we hung up, I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the half-finished grocery list in front of me. I had already bought Ethan a present earlier that week. A vintage Seahawks jacket I found online because he used to wear one almost exactly like it in high school. I remembered him at 17, lanky and smiling, stealing fries off my plate at the Tacoma Mall food court while talking about someday owning his own company. Back then he called me his best friend. The next morning I drove anyway. Not to the restaurant. Just near it. I do not know why. Maybe older mothers hold on to hope longer than dignity sometimes. The restaurant overlooked Lake Washington. All polished wood and giant windows facing the water. I parked across the street beneath a maple tree turning orange with autumn and watched through the glass as guests arrived. Vanessa wore white again. She always wore white when she wanted attention. Ethan laughed beside her while Chloe carried a birthday cake into the private dining room. Then I saw something that made my chest sink quietly inward. Baxter was there too. The hostess opened the front door smiling as one of the waiters carried in a special dog bed tied with silver ribbons. A few guests laughed and bent down to pet him. Ethan rubbed the dog behind the ears affectionately before wrapping his arm around Vanessa's waist. He looked happy. Completely happy. I sat in my car for almost 20 minutes before finally driving away. Rain blurred the windshield halfway home, and for one foolish second I wondered whether Ethan had even noticed I was missing. That night around 9:30, my phone buzzed with a text message. Happy birthday, dinner went great. Hope you are doing well, Mom. No epalegi. No invitasten. Just 12 polite words that sounded more like customer service than family. I stared at the screen until it dimmed black in my hands. Then slowly, painfully, something inside me began connecting pieces I had ignored for years. The older I get, the more I realize memory is not something that arrives all at once. It comes quietly, one moment at a time. A sentence, a look, a silence that suddenly means something different years later. After Ethan's birthday dinner, I could not stop replaying old memories in my mind. Not the big ones. The small ones I used to dismiss because love makes excuses for people long after it should stop. Sunday morning sunlight filled my apartment while I sat at the kitchen table with cold coffee and an untouched piece of toast, thinking about the first time Vanessa visited our home almost 12 years ago. She wore expensive boots even then, cream-colored leather with tiny gold buckles near the ankles. I remember apologizing because the heating system in our old Tacoma house made strange rattling noises during winter. Vanessa smiled politely before saying, "Older homes have character, I guess." At the time I thought she sounded sophisticated. Now I hear the judgment hidden underneath it. Harold noticed it too. My husband always understood people faster than I did. That night after they left, he stood washing dishes quietly before saying, "That girl likes comfort more than connection." I laughed and accused him of being too harsh. Harold just dried his hands slowly and said nothing else. 3 years later, he died from a stroke 2 weeks before Christmas. Ethan cried harder than I had ever seen a grown man cry. He held my hands at the funeral and promised we would always take care of each other. "You will never be alone, Mom," he whispered while snow fell softly outside the church cemetery. I believed him then with my entire heart. The first year after Harold died, Ethan called almost every day. Vanessa even brought soup over sometimes and helped organize paperwork. Looking back now, I realized something uncomfortable. The kindness started fading around the same time Ethan's company became successful. Success changes the atmosphere around certain people. Suddenly every conversation becomes about square footage, investments, exclusive schools, and neighborhoods with gated entrances. Little by little, I stopped feeling like family and started feeling like an outdated relative they were obligated to include. I remembered another moment while sitting there that morning. 4 years ago, during Thanksgiving dinner, Vanessa had walked into my kitchen carrying a tray of wine glasses while I mashed potatoes beside the stove. "Honestly, Margaret," she laughed lightly, "you stress too much about cooking. People our age just cater things now." Our age. She was 32 back then. I was 66. Yet somehow she already spoke to me like I belonged to another generation entirely. Even Ethan began changing in ways I barely noticed at first. He interrupted me more. Corrected little stories I told in front of guests. Once, during dinner at their old condo, I started talking about how Ethan used to sleep with a stuffed dinosaur until he was 10. Vanessa smiled tightly and said, "Some childhood memories do not really need to follow people forever." Everyone laughed softly except me. I understand now that humiliation rarely begins with cruelty. It begins with tiny revisions. A chair moved farther away. An invitation forgotten. A joke at your expense that nobody challenges because keeping peace feels easier than defending dignity. By the time the disrespect becomes undeniable, the people causing it have already convinced themselves it is normal. 3 days later, I ran into Daniel Mercer at a pharmacy in downtown Tacoma. I almost did not recognize him at first because he had lost weight since retirement, and his hair had turned almost completely white. Daniel used to handle financial operations for Ethan's company before stepping down the previous year. Harold trusted him. More importantly, Daniel was one of the few people who still looked older folks directly in the eye when speaking to them. I was standing near the blood pressure medication counter comparing generic prices when I heard someone say my name softly behind me. Margaret Whitmore? I turned and saw him holding a carton of milk and a newspaper beneath one arm. Daniel, I said with surprise. It has been years. We stood talking beside the pharmacy shelves for several minutes about ordinary things at first. The weather. Retirement. His granddaughter attending college in Spokane. But something in his expression kept shifting every time Ethan's name came up. A hesitation. Like he was trying to decide whether to say something uncomfortable. Finally, he lowered his voice slightly. How is Ethan doing these days? I smiled automatically. Busy, I suppose. But relieved things stabilized after the company troubles. Daniel blinked slowly. Company troubles? The moment stretched awkwardly between us. I felt something cold move through my chest. Last spring, I said carefully, Ethan said investors were pulling out. He needed emergency help. Daniel stared at me for 2 full seconds before looking down at the pharmacy floor tiles. Margaret, he said quietly, the company had one of its best financial years last year. I actually laughed a little then because the alternative felt too unbelievable. No, I said. There must be some mistake. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. I retired in March, but the numbers were strong even before I left. Ethan secured a major software contract around that time. Honestly, everyone thought he was expanding too quickly, because suddenly there was new spending everywhere. My fingers tightened around the prescription basket in my hand. New spending. Daniel looked reluctant now, like a decent man realizing too late he had opened a door that could not be closed again. The remodel on the Bellevue house. The new Range Rover. Vanessa's kitchen redesign. Ethan even joked once about finally living the way successful people should. I could hear my own heartbeat by then. Slow. Heavy. Are you saying Ethan never needed the money? Daniel rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. I do not know what he told you, Margaret. But the company was never close to collapsing. The pharmacy lights suddenly felt too bright. I stared past Daniel toward the automatic front doors sliding open and shut while rain blew sideways outside. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed near the greeting card aisle. Normal life continued around me, while something inside my understanding of my son quietly cracked apart. Daniel touched my arm gently. I am sorry, he said. I assumed you knew. I nodded politely because older women are trained to remain graceful, even while being humiliated. Then I picked up my medication, thanked him for the conversation, and walked carefully toward the parking lot. Halfway to my car, I stopped beneath the gray October sky and realized something devastating. Ethan had not taken my future because he was desperate. He had taken it because I was willing to give it. For 2 days after speaking with Daniel, I moved through life like someone carrying invisible glass inside her chest. I still folded laundry. Still watered the small fern beside my kitchen window. Still smiled politely at neighbors in the apartment hallway. But everything felt different now. As if the world I trusted had quietly shifted sideways while I was not paying attention. Ethan called Sunday afternoon for the first time in almost 2 weeks. Hey Mom, he said casually like nothing had happened. I could hear football commentators in the background and Baxter barking somewhere inside the house. Just checking in. His voice sounded normal. Warm even. That was the cruelest part. People rarely sound guilty when they believe their choices are justified. That is kind of you, I replied calmly. There was a short silence before he spoke again. Vanessa mentioned you seemed distant lately. Vanessa mentioned. Not Ethan noticed. I stared out my apartment window at rain sliding down the glass in crooked lines. I have simply been tired, I said. Another pause. Then his tone shifted slightly brighter. Actually, I wanted to ask something. Chloe has a school fundraiser next weekend, and Vanessa thought maybe you could volunteer at the registration table. I closed my eyes for a moment. There it was again. Not family. Function. They remembered me when they needed unpaid help, emotional labor or money. Never before. Never after. I do not think I can make it, I answered softly. Ethan sounded genuinely surprised. Really? Yes. Another silence stretched between us. Small, uncomfortable. Okay, he finally said. Well, maybe another time. He hung up less than a minute later. No, I love you. No concern. Just polite disappointment, like an employee declining an extra shift. That evening around 8:30, someone knocked gently on my apartment door. I assumed it was my upstairs neighbor returning a casserole dish. Instead, Chloe stood there alone wearing an oversized rain jacket and holding her backpack against her chest. Her cheeks were pink from the cold October wind. "Grandma," she whispered. "Can I come in for a minute?" I stepped aside immediately. Chloe had Harold's eyes, soft blue and observant. She sat carefully at my tiny kitchen table while I made hot chocolate the way she liked it, with extra marshmallows and cinnamon sprinkled on top. For several minutes she said nothing, just stirred the drink slowly with a spoon while staring at the steam rising from the mug. Then finally she looked up at me. "Mom has been talking about you a lot lately." Something in her expression made my stomach tighten. "Talking how?" Chloe hesitated. "Last week I heard her and Dad arguing after dinner." Her fingers tightened around the mug. "Mom said your apartment is wasting money because eventually you are going to need assisted living anyway." I felt very still suddenly. Chloe continued quietly. "She said if you sold the beach cabin too, everybody could finally stop worrying about your finances." The room seemed to lose warmth around me. I had not even realized Vanessa knew the Cannon Beach cabin was still in my name. Chloe lowered her voice further. "Dad did not say much. But he did not defend you either. Children notice everything adults try to hide." I reached across the table and covered Chloe's hand gently with mine. Her skin felt cold from the rain. "Thank you for telling me," I said calmly. But inside something had changed forever. Because for the first time, I no longer felt confused about what was happening to me. I finally understood I was not slowly drifting away from my family. I was being quietly removed from it. The next morning I drove to Portland for the first time in nearly a year. The highway stretched gray and damp beneath low autumn clouds while old country songs played softly through my car speakers. I used to enjoy driving. Harold and I would spend entire weekends wandering coastal towns with no destination in mind, stopping for clam chowder or antique stores whenever something caught our attention. But this drive felt different, heavier somehow. Like every mile carried me farther away from the woman I had spent most of my life being. By 11 o'clock, I was sitting inside the office of Harold's old attorney, Walter Green. Walter had to be close to 80 now, but he still wore pressed suits and polished loafers like a man who believed dignity mattered even in old age. His office smelled faintly of leather folders and black coffee. Framed photographs of his grandchildren lined the bookshelf behind his desk. "Margaret," he said warmly as he shook my hand. "It has been too long." I smiled politely and sat across from him while rain tapped gently against the windows overlooking downtown Portland. For a moment I almost lost my nerve. There is something deeply painful about admitting your own child has become someone you no longer recognize. But then I remembered Chloe's quiet voice in my kitchen. Assisted living. Stop worrying about your finances. The words steadied me. Walter listened carefully while I explained everything. Not dramatically, just facts. The retirement money. The lies about Ethan's business. The conversations Chloe overheard. Walter's expression darkened more with every sentence. When I finished, he removed his glasses slowly and folded his hands together on the desk. "Did Ethan ever ask about the Cannon Beach property specifically?" he asked. "Not directly," I answered. "But Vanessa seems very aware it exists." Walter nodded once. I suspected this might happen eventually. Something in his tone made me sit straighter. He opened a drawer and removed a thick cream-colored folder with Harold's name embossed across the front. "Your husband made several revisions to your estate plan before he passed." I stared at him confused. "Revisions?" Walter slid the folder toward me carefully. "Margaret, the Cannon Beach cabin is not part of Ethan's inheritance." I blinked slowly. "What do you mean?" "Harold transferred full ownership into a protected trust solely under your control 3 months before his stroke." My breath caught slightly. Harold never mentioned that to me. Walter continued gently. "He loved Ethan deeply, but he worried about financial influence inside the marriage. He specifically instructed that the property could not be sold, borrowed against, or inherited without your direct written approval. For several seconds I could not speak at all. I suddenly remembered one evening years ago when Harold stood repairing the porch railing at the cabin while Ethan and Vanessa argued inside over vacation expenses. Harold watched the ocean quietly before saying, "Some people inherit values. Others inherit appetites." At the time I thought he was simply tired. Now I realized he had already seen something I refused to acknowledge. Walter leaned forward slightly. "Margaret, legally speaking, you still have options. More than they realize." I looked down at Harold's signature resting at the bottom of the documents. Strong, certain, protective even after death. And for the first time in months, something unfamiliar settled inside me. Not anger. Not sadness. Clarity. 2 weeks passed before Ethan called again. This time his voice sounded different the moment I answered. Tighter. Less polished. "Mom," he said quickly, "do you have time to come by for dinner Friday night? Vanessa wants to clear the air about a few things." I stood beside my apartment window watching rain drift across the parking lot, while his words settled in my chest. Clear the air. Interesting how people suddenly become interested in family harmony when something in their own lives begins falling apart. "I suppose I can," I answered calmly. Ethan sounded relieved immediately. "Good. Great." 7 o'clock. Friday evening arrived cold and windy. The trees lining their Bellevue neighborhood had nearly lost all their leaves, and wet orange maple branches scraped softly against the sidewalks as I walked toward the front door. Vanessa greeted me with unusual warmth. "Margaret," she said brightly, hugging me for the first time in months. "You look wonderful." I noticed 2 things immediately. First, she was nervous. Second, Baxter's expensive dog bed had been moved away from the dining table entirely. Small details reveal everything once you learn how to look properly. Dinner felt carefully rehearsed. Ethan kept refilling my wine glass. Vanessa complimented my earrings twice. Even Chloe looked uncomfortable, quietly pushing green beans around her plate while glancing between her parents and me. Halfway through dinner, Ethan cleared his throat and folded his hands together. "Mom," he began carefully, "business has been under some pressure lately." There it was. I remained silent. Vanessa leaned forward slightly with practiced concern softening her voice. "We know things have felt strained recently, and honestly we hate that. Family should support each other." I almost admired how naturally she could speak words she did not believe. Ethan continued explaining that a major investor had unexpectedly withdrawn from one of his projects. Cash flow problems. Temporary setbacks. Stress. Different vocabulary this time, but the same performance underneath it. Then finally he looked directly at me. "We were wondering if you had given any more thought to selling the Cannon Beach cabin." The room became very still. Even the soft jazz playing through hidden speakers seemed to fade into the background. Vanessa spoke gently before I could answer. "It just seems impractical for one person to maintain a property like that alone, especially at your age." At your age. Such a polite way to reduce someone's entire existence to inconvenience. I set my wine glass down carefully on the tablecloth. "Interesting," I said quietly. Ethan blinked. "What is?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "The last time you needed money, you said it was about survival. Now it sounds more like lifestyle management." Vanessa's smile tightened almost invisibly. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mom, that is not fair." "Fair?" I thought about my empty retirement account, my cut medication pills, the birthday dinner invitation that never came. Then I reached into my purse and slowly placed a small silver key onto the table between us. The key to the Cannon Beach cabin. Vanessa's eyes locked onto it immediately. Ethan looked relieved too quickly. Neither of them noticed the calmness in me had changed completely. Because for the first time since Harold died, I was no longer sitting at their table hoping to be loved. I was simply watching them reveal themselves. Vanessa reached for the silver key almost instinctively, but I placed my hand over it before her fingers could touch the table. The movement was small, calm, yet it changed the entire atmosphere in the room. Ethan looked confused first, then uneasy. Vanessa slowly leaned back into her chair, her smile thinning around the edges like paper left too long in sunlight. "Margaret," she said carefully, "we are only trying to think practically about the future." I nodded once. "So am I." Silence settled over the dining room. Somewhere upstairs, a faucet dripped faintly through the walls. Chloe sat perfectly still beside her plate, watching all of us with wide, nervous eyes. I looked down at the silver key beneath my hand before speaking again. I met with Walter Green last week. Ethan frowned immediately. Dad's old attorney? Yes. Vanessa's expression changed almost too quickly to notice, but I saw it. Alarm. Just for a second. Why? Ethan asked. I folded my napkin slowly and placed it beside my plate. Because after learning the truth about your business, I realized there were probably other things I should understand more clearly. Ethan's face drained of color little by little. Mom, what truth? Even then he tried pretending. That was the saddest part. Not the lie itself, but how easily it came to him now. Daniel Mercer told me the company was thriving when I emptied my retirement account. Vanessa opened her mouth immediately. Margaret, I think there has been some misunderstanding about. No, I interrupted softly. There has not. The room went completely still. I had never interrupted her before. Not once in 12 years. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face roughly. Mom, things were complicated back then. Complicated enough to buy a luxury vehicle? I asked quietly. Complicated enough to remodel a kitchen with imported marble countertops? Vanessa crossed her arms. Defensively. We worked hard for our life. I looked directly at her for the first time all evening. And I worked hard for mine. Neither of us looked away. I suddenly understood something important in that moment. Vanessa had mistaken my kindness for weakness from the very beginning. People like her often do. They believe quiet women cannot become dangerous simply because they do not raise their voices. Ethan leaned forward desperately now. Mom, nobody wanted to hurt you. I almost smiled at that. Hurt does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives through exclusion, through manipulation, through watching your child slowly calculate your worth based on what you can still provide. I slid the silver key back into my purse carefully. Vanessa's eyes followed the movement immediately. The cabin is not for sale, I said calmly, and neither of you will ever inherit it. Ethan stared at me in shock. What? Your father protected that property before he died. Legally. Vanessa's entire posture stiffened. You cannot be serious. I am completely serious. My voice never rose above normal conversation. That seemed to unsettle them more than anger would have. Ethan looked devastated now, but I could no longer tell how much of it came from guilt and how much came from losing access to something valuable. Mom, he whispered, please. I stood slowly from the table and picked up my coat. For a moment nobody moved. Even Baxter remained quiet near the fireplace. Then Chloe stood too and hurried toward me before I reached the front door. She wrapped her arms around my waist tightly. I love you, Grandma, she whispered. I held her gently against me and closed my eyes for one brief second. Then I looked past her toward Ethan and Vanessa standing frozen beneath the warm dining room lights of the house I helped pay for. You spent years treating me like I was temporary, I said softly. So eventually I stopped treating this family like home. Then I walked out into the cold November rain without looking back.